Today we're pleased to welcome back to the studio John Arvanitis, Associate Managing Director for Compliance at Kroll. John, welcome back.
Thanks, Richard, and again, it's great to be here with you today.
Terrific. So John, in the 2018 Kroll Ethisphere Anti-Bribery and Corruption Benchmarking Report, 93% of the respondents think that their ABC risks, their anti-bribery risks, will remain the same or worsen this year. The report calls that staggering, and I'd have to agree. So now the interesting part is it's not due to a concern in the rise of risk in the operating environment, for example, increased exposure to corruption, but instead it's attributable to a concern with respect to the increased enforcement of current regulations and the prospect of new ones. Okay, so what's going on here?
I think that statement speaks volumes, right? I think that, as you said, the globalization of enforcement operations across the continents throughout the world have been very, very evident over the last 2-year period of time. I think that as enforcement operations occur, investigative agencies and regulators seek to follow and track down all leads available to them. I think that kind of raises the temperature for multinational corporations and causes them to think about more and more potential risk that they may be buying.
So are we talking about corporate enforcement, or are we talking about individual liability, or both?
I think we're talking about both. As we talked about before, Richard, the days of fines are long gone. I think the days of fines and personal accountability are here to stay. People who make decisions to be involved with nefarious and illicit activity are sought after by regulators and law enforcement and governing bodies to be able to hold them accountable for their decisions. No stone will be unturned.
Right. So is this an issue where multinationals are realizing this is not just about the FCPA, it's about, the UK and recent French regulations, and saying that they have multiple exposure out there?
No question. It's FCPA, it's the UK Bribery Act, it's Sapin 2, it's any and other statutes, AML, and other ways to bring to justice individuals who conduct, as we've talked about, illicit activity.
So I guess it's getting everybody's attention now.
It has gotten everyone's attention.
Okay, so let's talk about a bit of an unfair question, so I'm definitely going to ask it. Let's talk about our regulatory and enforcement environment of today. It seems like it's really a major part of the compliance discourse right now. So we had the FCPA pilot program, the Yates memo as examples, have all been somewhat transitioned to more policy guidance and policy administration and policy in this administration. So can you give us an overview of where you see the current enforcement regime and where it might be heading? There seems to be this unanswerable and endless debate on self-disclosure, which the regulators are certainly now encouraging. So can you address that as well?
I think that if anyone doesn't think that these statutes and these global regulations are of concern to regulators and governing bodies, the day has come that you need to understand it, that they are. I think what you want to look at is how can you prepare yourself through your compliance program to prepare yourself, assess risk, mitigate risk, and be able to be successful in the global environment today.
Understood. So let's go to the epicenter or the Achilles heel of a compliance program, third parties, channel partners. This issue did not go away this year, where a quarter of the respondents did not feel confident in their ability to detect third-party violations of anti-bribery laws. So John, this is not a new issue, but it seems to be a persistent one. So what do you see going on?
I think third parties have always been the challenge, as you described, Richard. I think organizations and multinational corporations through their compliance programs need to aggressively seek to collect information that is impactful for them to be able to drive the identification of risk. The ability to refresh data is huge in this process. And I think we're at the stage now in compliance programs where compliance professionals want to say, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do business with this individual or this entity. Compliance professionals, as both you and I know, are extremely passionate about their profession. They take their obligations extremely seriously. It's a 24-hour day, 7-day-a-week responsibility, and they want to make decisions that are in the best interests of their businesses and organizations.
So do you see sort of the bar being raised on, what sort of the least common denominator is before an organization now lets that third party, that Achilles heel, through the front door?
I think that it's a conversation amongst multiple elements of a business on onboarding a third party today. Whereas in the past, maybe you just had one individual that made the decision to say, yep, we're going to work with this guy or girl. Now we're talking about multiple people weighing in based on information that's provided. Risk assessment and balancing risk and reward, those are the key dynamics of this process.
Oh, understood. But let's talk about the positive, right? And this is so interesting. 58% of respondents reported the detection of an issue during ongoing monitoring. That is after initial due diligence. Now that's a strong development, and I think it demonstrates how risk lives during the life of a relationship. So here's my question, and I'm still stuck on this a little bit. From your experience, what should trigger ongoing and interval monitoring after the onboarding? The report well states there's no regulatory guidance for frequency other than you should do it. So for an organization that has a robust onboarding and due diligence process, what happens afterwards?
Well, let's first talk about what you described on the front end of that statement. Was the right level of due diligence conducted?
Okay.
What does your due diligence process actually look like?
All right.
What degrees of information are you collecting? Now let's transition to monitoring. If you've collected the wrong type of data, you may not be able to flush out potential risk in the post-monitoring stage. But if you collect the right type of risk, then you are prepared and you may be successful in getting the degree of risk identified in your monitoring process.
But what triggers the monitoring?
I think you always want to monitor. I think there's not a single third party out there that doesn't deserve to be monitored during the course of the relationship. But I think to answer your question, the factor of risk and where they are in the risk spectrum, low, medium, or high, risk ranked, is really, really of importance here.
I remember once I was on the phone with an agent who was sharing with me, this was back in my defense days, and he said, look, we haven't been doing too much business here. It was in South America. He said, but we just had a new election, and with the new election comes a new Minister of Interior and a new Minister of Defense. Those were my clients. And he said, they're going to put all new people in procurement. And he said, quote unquote, those new folks in procurement are my buddies, and they know they only have a few years to make their pension. So there's a case where a change in the external environment, in this case it was a change in the regime, totally changed where that particular channel partner sat on, for lack of a better term, that continuum of corruption.
Right.
So do you think that it's just interval on a sort of a random or a sort of well-articulated basis, or is it also based on external triggering events?
I think it's a little bit of both.
Both? Okay.
I think so. I think the conundrum that you were put in really, really shows how governmental affiliations and political risk can impact an organization. But I think that as you assess risk, you can drive decisions on whether you want to continue a relationship with a third party and their entity.
Yeah, I look at what's going on in Saudi Arabia right now. It's nothing less than revolutionary with their anti-corruption drive. I mean, you might not know who your customer is, who your client is, based on the change of all the people that are going to be seated at these different ministries.
Well, I think you have to ask your third party, who are you doing business with?
Right.
Who's in your supply chain? And how far down do you go? If your third party can express to you that they have their own risk process in place, then that could give you a certain degree of comfort. But it's your risk tolerance that's of most importance here. And I think that if you have a relationship, if you build a relationship with a third party, you're transparent and you communicate to the third party your organization's ethical code and desires, I think you may potentially find yourself in a productive relationship at the end of the day.
It just shows you how dynamic our risk world is. It's anything but static, right?
Yeah, no question. We face risk many, many times a day. The key is, do you see the risk coming at you?
Understood. Well, the report talks a little bit about a data refresh. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and the use of data in third-party monitoring in general?
Sure, Richard. As we know, we collect a lot of data relative to third parties. There's questionnaire processes, there's onboarding information regarding a third party and their entity. That's all very valuable data. Your ability to continually refresh that data to make sure that it's still accurate is imperative, because if it's not refreshed appropriately and not up to date, you may not be able to flush out the risk that may be associated with a third party.
Does that go back to the earlier part of the report that we talked about in terms of that cross-functional collaboration between information technology and the compliance?
Absolutely, no question. The more that the different elements have from an information flow within an organization, the more you're able to look at for potential risk factors and red flags associated with a third party.
Understood, but one of the challenges, and again, I'm wondering if this is also the unsolvable problem, is risk ranking, okay? And, how does a multinational risk rank? And if you could talk about that both in theory, what that means, and practically what a company should do, some best practices that you've seen, I think that would be really helpful.
Sure. In theory, Richard, risk ranking revolves around assigning low, medium, and high levels of risk based on risk criteria and your organization's pain points, issues that may potentially be problematic for you and your organization. What could those be? Adverse media, political affiliation, state-owned entity, sanctions, jurisdictions, things along those lines. What we find a lot of times is that by using those factors in a questionnaire process and assigning risk to each and every one of those factors, cumulatively you can establish a low, medium, and high score that buckets, for better practical terms, your third party into a specific criteria, into a specific category that shows you the level of risk that exists. And I think the other key piece of this risk ranking process is and revolves around using technological solutions to be able to manage your collection process and your information flow and contact with a third party. Because as we talked about, documentation, should there ever be an issue in regards to a third party, is imperative. Questions can be asked. How did you onboard? What did you collect? How did you due diligence and screen the individual? What kind of internal documentation did they have or provide to you relative to their compliance programs? Those are all key documents that should be maintained in one central repository in your process, so that should the need ever arise, you're able to put your hand on them and show regulators you have an automated and standardized process to meet the regulatory obligation.
And what drives it at first? Is it the country that drives the risk ranking?
That could be one of your first criteria. Some multinationals may view jurisdiction as a high-risk category for them and a factor that may influence their decision-making. Second could be the amount of spend that you may be involved with a potential third party, how payments occur across the board with the third party. Are they done in cash? Are they done via money orders? Are they done, wire transfers? However that's facilitated. I think that, as I stated, your pain points or the organization's pain points and the type of information you want to collect to drive your risk tolerance is what's most imperative.
And then what do you do with the risk ranking? In other words, are you taking sort of the accumulation of that data and saying on low-risk countries we're going to do one level of due diligence and then you're upping it from there?
Correct. There can be an escalation process so that if you have medium or high risk, there may be internal stakeholders who have to decide on whether you're going to onboard and work with a specific third party. There may be, based on the levels of risk, a certain degree of due diligence from a scoping standpoint that has to be done to meet your organization's obligation to be able to potentially deal and work with a third party and their entity.
Do you see companies really understanding, though, the need to do this upfront? In other words, I've experienced where you have business leaders sort of going into a market, a lucrative market, right, where you see exciting and lucrative opportunities intertwined with corruption risk. But do you see them going to their compliance leaders up front saying, what's going to be the spend here? How much due diligence are we going to need to do? And does that make sense for the type of market that we're looking to enter into? Are you seeing those sort of business discussions beforehand, or is it all happening after boots are on the ground?
I think let's go back to the original statement. With the way the situation is today, with the advent of the Yates Memo, the pilot program, and all the other documents throughout the world and guidance that's been provided throughout the world, I think compliance professionals have gotten it now that this has to be done on the front side. Compliance should be and is a proactive tool to evaluating risk and potential risk that exists. How else do you measure your third party other than through a processes similar to this? I think that if you only look at the potential revenue, you're potentially putting your organization in a position to be criticized and unfortunately looked upon potentially for illegal activity involving third parties.
So you really do see that it's sort of, let's get a clear-eyed view of these risks that we face before we're in the middle of it, and let's understand what the upfront investment is, and does it make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. You want to know more on the front side before you jump into the relationship and move forward and into any potential business transactions with a third party.
No, that's certainly a positive development. And I guess the report also demonstrates, being that a lot of the respondents talked about how the third parties did not accurately report information at the onboarding process, but there was sort of bad behavior detected afterwards due to the ongoing monitoring that just shows you can't just accept what a company's giving you, coming to your front door.
Absolutely, and I think a really, really great bit of information that this year's report revealed, Richard, was that there were third parties that came forward and self-reported themselves to their partners. And I think that goes to the great efforts that compliance programs put forward in educating their third parties, providing them with training, and getting them to understand their compliance commitments.
That's a huge development. Thank you for bringing that up.
No, I think that's an important tidbit in this year's report.
Terrific. Well, John, thanks for joining me. Let's see what next year brings.
It's always a pleasure, Richard.
Likewise.
Good to see you soon.
Thanks.